The gram.
I won't tag you then.
No.
All right, so we're live. We're getting some interesting feedback here that Caryn doesn't have an Instagram. Shock horror. But that's not the point of today's little talk. Welcome back to the Carb-Appropriate podcast. I'm back again with Dr. Mikki Williden and Dr. Dan Plews, and we're joined today by Dr. Caryn Zinn. All of this crew have done a fair amount of research in low-carb diets and nutrition, have a lot of experience practically in that field. And so today we were going to have a little chat about low carb and hormone balance overall, and for a few specific outcomes, because that seems to be a very common topic at the moment in the sort of, what's that?
Hot topic.
It's a hot topic.
Yeah.
It's a common topic. It's a hot topic. It's all those things. So I'll open up maybe to each of you. What are some of the theories that you've heard about low carb and hormone balance overall? Maybe start with you, Caryn.
I guess, I've been doing low carb now for about 7-8 years or so. And to be fair, I've been doing it from a practical perspective. I've been doing it in a similar way with males and females, right? Because the way that I work is that I tend to individualize my program towards the person in front of me, and based on the situation and the circumstances that they bring, not whether they are male or female. Of course, males and females come with their own different traits and things. But I guess the overwhelming, not really overwhelming, but the thread that I see a lot, that I have seen a lot over the last couple of years, is that women, that statement, women are not small men, and women they've got different set of circumstances, and that low carb doesn't work for women, and that's I've always kind of scratched my head when I've heard that, because I think there might be some women that it doesn't work for from a hormone blunting perspective, but yeah. I've had an incredible amount of success with low carb and women. So so it's what I've been hearing, which is not consistent always with what I see in practice. And of course, once we talk about the literature, we'll see that, I might leave that as a bit of a surprise.
So Dan, Caryn brings up an interesting point. It's sort of a trope that's trotted out a lot, which is that women are not just small men. Do you have any comments on that, or any ideas about whether that's, true, false, maybe neither?
Yeah, I think it's neither, really. There's there's also small men, right? And it's that idea that everyone is an individual and everybody is different regardless of the gender. And if you look at any diet, whatever it be, a low carb diet, a high carb diet, a high protein diet, a carnivore diet, a vegan diet, different people respond in different ways. And it's more, and I would say it's not so much a gender thing, than it's more of a individuality than anything else.
Yeah. What's your perspective on that, Mikki?
Yeah, no, I would just echo the sentiments of both Caryn and Dan, and I often think, well, the people who are like, women are not small men, almost want to group all women in the same boat as well. So it's kind of almost being quite myopic about this whole individualized approach, I suppose. I feel like I get a lot of people asking me questions around fasted training, which isn't necessarily about, it's not directly low carb, but additionally it's low carbohydrate availability when they train. And I've got women who are too scared to train in a fasted state for fear of the stress response, which is actually a necessary response in order to get some of these endurance adaptations, So I feel like there's a lot of fear in female athletes to actually do things which would help enhance their approach. Equally, though, low carb means so many different things depending on that individual. You know, it could for one person be 30 grams of carbs or below. For another, it could be 130 grams. You know, so it's recognizing that that carbohydrate intake works on a spectrum, and that spectrum is, you know, different means different things for different people.
That's a great point, and I think that it's worth bringing up the topic of fasted training, and also perhaps the aversion that a lot of people have to high intensity interval training or high intensity training at all, because of those same fears, right? Women, there's also almost an absolute that I hear from some practitioners, which is that women should not train fasted, number one. They should not do high intensity training, number two, because of this fear of cortisol. And, you know, obviously cortisol is going to be released in response to a fast, but a transient increase in cortisol is not going to really cause any, you know, major problem. It's just a way that we can help to free up fuel or maybe suppress some inflammation. It's going to basically help get us through those periods. And it seems to me like we're disempowering women by telling them as an absolute they can't do this stuff, even though it's often under the guise of empowerment, because it's this idea that women are different and should be treated differently in all respects. I'd love to hear both Caryn and Dan's opinion on that as well, but I'll start with Dan, because you're obviously an exercise physiologist, and so you'll have an insight into the physiology of fasted training and high intensity training for women.
Yeah, well, I guess from the start, you know, I work with a lot of like Olympic athletes who are women, and I can tell you that the amount of high intensity training that they do is high, and it goes to it's the same. It's that any, you know, too much high intensity interval training is definitely can be damaging, but it's all about that balance, right? And it's balancing it with the right training program. So I'll just say that from the start, but yeah, in terms of what's happening with the fasted training is it's just basically it's increasing the stress response. And if you think of training as in a very simplest of terms, it is a dose response relationship. So if you think about the supercompensation cycle, the bigger the stress, the bigger the dip in performance, and eventually the bigger the supercompensation and the performance improvement that we get. So what we're trying to do with fasted training is increase the stress response and basically make that training a little bit harder, so then we'll thereby get a bigger improvement in our training or in our performance. But also, if you look at some of the literature, whether it's low glycogen training, whether it's fasted training, whatever that might be, it does seem to sway towards the fact that some of the biochemical and markers of training adaptation, so we can actually measure them in the lab. We can go into some muscle markers and look at some of those those markers of training adaptation are actually greater when we do training in a fasted or low glycogen state rather than a fully carbohydrate replenished state. And
I think we need to, you know, obviously understand that stress is not the enemy. It's an excessive stress or sort of chronic stress that is without a conclusion, basically.
Yeah, if you want to look at the other way, stress is the ultimate thing that if we're talking it from a training standpoint, the stress is actually what we're trying to do. If you think about good training and good training programming, it's to get that stress level to the absolute maximum amount that you can possibly absorb or hold without becoming overtrained or negatively tired. This kind of idea of negative training adaptation. So like the stress is actually what we're trying to achieve, and the way you can achieve that stress is done through basically training intensity and training distribution and training duration. So, you know, I was actually asked the other day, you know, someone asked me and they said, you know, do you think people train too hard? And I'm like, that word hard when it comes to trainings, you can't just place it on anything. Like it's hard, as you know, it'll be hard to bench press 150 kilos, but, you know, it's also hard to run a marathon. You know, it's hard to sprint 100 meters. You can't say the word hard about the context of duration. And that's where I think people get a little bit mixed up, is that you have to, the balance is absolutely key. And that's where good training programs, not in terms of what you do on each day, is that distribution of intensity and volume in every single training session that you're doing, but ultimately it is the overall stress that you're trying to get to the right amount so you can cope with it.
Yeah, that's a really good point, and I may be off base here, but I probably have quite a similar approach to all three of you, actually, that I'm more likely to gear training and nutrition to the individual rather than the gender, because I see an enormous overlap between those genders, right? While on balance, we might say that men are perhaps a little bit more resilient to that high intensity training, or maybe a little bit more resilient to fasting, just as an example. It's not that much, and the overlap between individuals is enormous. So I might have an extremely resilient female athlete versus someone who, you know, a male who is not that resilient to those things. And so really, it's almost like the effect between them in terms of the absoluteness of the gender is so small, it doesn't really have much of an effect from my point of view for prescription. Would you agree or disagree with that, Caryn?
I would say, just looking to what Dan started off with and what you've continued with, you plan a training program to get the best out of the athlete, to get the best outcome for, I guess minimal harm or no harm, but you want to apply the stress, but not over apply it so that there's overtraining syndrome. And I think the same is with nutrition, whether it's male or female, and you can suggest to an athlete, try this. And I'm a big fan of start low and go slow. To try small amounts of this, and of course the athlete, the typical athlete will go, well, that's great, therefore I'll do a whole lot more because that will be better. That is where you get that kind of, you sort of tip the threshold. So I think there's a threshold with training, but there's also a threshold with nutrition, and it doesn't only come with the amount of fasting, and it doesn't only come with the amount of carbs. It comes with the overall roundness of the diet. Like, what are they actually eating, and what are their micronutrient status like? What is their hydration status like? And of course, their personality is key. You talked about resilience, and I think that's the word. I know it's a bit of a buzzword at the moment. No one really knows what it is. But in my mind, if you've got a resilient athlete, it doesn't matter if they're male, female, black or blue or whatever. If they'll stick to just below those thresholds that they're going to harm themselves, then that's the way to do it. But sometimes you have to go over the threshold to know that you're not going to go down that road again. So I'm not sure if I've answered your question, but I certainly think there's a threshold there for diet and exercise that the athlete needs to together carefully. Can
I just add to that, because I think it's a really interesting point, is that, like, Caryn just reminded me that, we're trying to achieve a stress, and basically as whether you're a coach or you're a nutritionist, you're trying to achieve the same thing. You're trying, if we're talking about a sport performance standpoint specifically, we're trying to get an event. You've got a number of tools in your toolbox to elicit a certain stress, whether that be more or less. And that doesn't mean that, if you want to elicit more stress, you can do high intensity interval training. It doesn't mean you're going to do that same thing all the time, because the real trick is to bring it back when you need it. And you can say the same for diet. Like, fasted training could potentially have very specific adaptations that you might be looking for as an athlete, whether that be, you're trying to increase your fat oxidation, you're trying to increase certain, like, mitochondrial number, for example. So you're trying to increase the signal to make that adaptation. But there are times when doing that properly is quite stressful. So you can pull that in and pull it out as you need to with the specific requirements of the individual. Because if someone's already got a very high fat oxidation, but they're lacking on the VO2 end, you might not even need to consider doing, that sort of training, the fasted sort of training. Yeah. But it's about having the tools in your toolbox that you use at the appropriate times.
And I think both of you have kind of got me thinking on a couple of things. So Dan, if I just, with regards to what you've said, it's that whole idea of periodization within nutrition, right? Because if you're working with an athlete, then you've got the time where you might want to enhance their fat adaptation, but then there are other times where you want to really look after recovery, or where you need to ensure their immune status is optimal because they're going into a competition or they're traveling for competition or something like that. So those nutrient requirements will change depending on that. And I think, I feel that as low carb practitioners, if you want to call us that, we're often, people think, oh, she does low carb, so nothing I ever do is ever about high carb, you know, because they're not understanding how I work as a practitioner. And Caryn, you've got to, I mean, your point about the athlete's personality is, that's absolutely key, because you'll get those athletes who will absolutely push to the nth degree no matter what you say to them, and so they'll end up broken, and they'll say, well, it was because of that low carb diet I was on, not thinking actually it was because I took that one recommendation and applied it to every single training session and every single scenario. And I feel sometimes as well that athletes have to think more broadly beyond just their diet and think about, you know, how am I sleeping, how am I recovering, what is, you know, am I resilient, that word, and everything else in everyday life, what's my mood like, and really look at these other qualitative measures too, and be honest about how they're tracking, because oftentimes when an athlete hits on diet and thinks of it like a magic bullet, they'll just push on without making kind of adjustments if they need to, sort of related to that kind of.
What makes it a little bit disconcerting probably for athletes, and maybe for practitioners as well, is they want a template. You know, I've got an athlete, you know, when do I do high carb, when do I do low carb, when do I periodize this? And it's almost like, without giving too much away, we kind of, you know, we're all feeling our way in the dark. There isn't really the research to lead us down that template. So it's using your experience and your intuition of the whole situation and the whole athlete to go, well, actually, how about let's try this, see how you go with that. Oh, that didn't work. Okay, let's try something else. Or that worked. That's great. Do that for a little while. Let's try this in this situation. And it's very trial and error. And some athletes don't like that at all. Or some practitioners don't like that because they want to learn this stuff and they don't realize that they have to kind of figure it out.
Yeah, one thing that comes to mind as you guys are talking about this as well is that often people are talking about absolutes with respect to, particularly for fasted training, as to there going to be effects from fasted training, increased cortisol, maybe, you know, reductions in performance because you don't have enough glycogen, all that kind of stuff. But we need to consider that, let's face it, most of the people we deal with are not maybe the people that Dad's dealing with, elite level Olympic athletes. They are just gen pop, right? And I consider them athletes because I think anyone wants to be optimally healthy is going to have to move, right? So to some degree, they're an athlete. But if that means they're going to a CrossFit class 3 times a week, or they're training in the gym 4 times a week for 45 minutes, what's the real effect going to be on cortisol increase and how long is it going to last from, you know, a relatively moderate 45-minute gym session? And, you know, is there going to be any real effect in glycogen depletion that you can't replete from? Of course there's not. So, you know, or are they fat adapted is another interesting thing. Like, how have they developed a capacity to respond to either fasting or low carb? Because we know from the FASTER study, for example, that low carb athletes don't necessarily have lower carb stores, which kind of blew people's minds, right? So if you've been through that period of adaptation, are you really going to have the same degree of cortisol increase when you're training in a relatively, you know, low duration event? I would suggest probably not. Well, what would I know? I'm just the dumb nutritionist.
It's it's an interesting one with the whole cortisol thing, because, you know, I guess if you look at even ketogenic diets in general, like when you use that word ketogenic, at least, you know, cortisol is higher, but I think we're all in the idea that you don't necessarily need to be in ketosis continuously. It's more of a cyclical thing anyway. Well,
it's also limited because, you know, even the research on fasting shows that cortisol, there's no doubt it goes up, but it's limited to about 2 weeks, and then it seems to acclimate pretty quickly.
Exactly. And at the same time, you'd also see ketones go down, right? If someone was on, gradually over time, someone's on the same amount of carbohydrates, they'd start off to get a big bump up, and then at least the BHB measured in the blood would also go down over time. And I do wonder if there's a kind of a, it's because you, like, linking it back to that FASTA study, it's because you are generally better at preserving the carbohydrates you eat. You kind of equalize yourself, and then overall, your overall stress response is just lower anyway. So for a fat adapted athlete who's been in it long term, maybe that they do have some better recoverability in terms of high intensity training and training in general. I mean, from my own experiences as an athlete myself, one of the biggest things I've found, like, since changing my diet in 2012 and having success myself since, is that my recoverability between higher intensity sessions is very good, and I can back up session on session on session quite easily. Whereas, even some of the pros that I coach, I have to be a bit more tender with them than I am with myself, for example, because I don't have time to do the same volume, but I can back up higher intensity sessions time and time again. I do think it's because overall, after you've had a period of adaptation, your overall systemic inflammation is lower. You generally recover faster. You don't have as much glucose spill out when you're doing any sort of exercise. So for me to have a massive glucose spill, I would have to be going very, very hard. It's, I'm not talking about I'm really churning into the carbohydrates until a much higher work rate. So overall, these things are really beneficial, and means that, one of the most important things of exercise training is consistency and backing day in and day out. Not one training session doesn't make any difference to your overall fitness, but session after session after session after session is the thing that makes the difference. And I think that's where you can, that might be the overall thing. So actually the hormones are playing in your favor in that particular instance.
Yeah. So I think we've sort of been talking a lot for those people listening in about athletic populations, but I think there's a good reason for that, because a lot of this research that the idea that we need to have a certain amount of carbohydrate, I think, was built on that older research, which showed that if an athlete's carbohydrate intake was too low, then they would have a higher cortisol to free testosterone ratio. And so I think that led a lot of people for a long time to think, well, to preserve testosterone, but also to suppress, excessive cortisol, we need to have a certain amount of carbohydrate. But from what I've seen, I'm not sure if you guys agree or not here, but there seems to be as much impact from lipid sufficiency as there does from carbohydrate sufficiency, which kind of tells me, if we dig into the data, what we typically see is that when athletes are underfueled, they have a problem with hormone balance. And that takes care of, 90% of the problem in most respects. So given that, why do you think that people are so keyed in on carbohydrate as being this primary dictator of hormone balance? Is there research that points to that specifically, do you think? Or do you think it's just become something that's a mainstream idea that people haven't really questioned?
Well, I just jump in there. So from my opinion, I think it's just come from that classic dogma of carbohydrate being the main energy source for exercise. Time and time again, you always hear it. And then you get some people who some athletes who go to the nth degree and you tell them to do one thing and they do a million things, and they overtrain and their hormones go out of the window. And then they go, oh, well, you don't work for me as a practitioner, so I'll go to someone else. And someone else goes, no, low carb, it just, I see time and time again, low carb doesn't work for women. And it might be just because, dare I say it, they're not doing it properly, or they're doing something wrong. So I think they've got nothing else to pin it on apart from the carbohydrate, because the literature is clearly not there. It's not there. And I've been in 2 presentations where I've heard 200 grams of carbohydrate is needed as a minimum for optimal hormone function. And I remember saying to the person next to me, it might have been you, Mikki, and I'm like, where does that come from? And you go, I don't know. And then I heard on a podcast about low carb not working for women, and the person who was conducting the podcast said, "Oh, really? Can you send me information?" Yeah, we've done research. We've done research in our lab to show this. Can you send me information? Sure. I got in touch with these people and said, "Can you please send me the studies? Because I really, like, I'm not trying to be annoying here. I really want to see this research that I've clearly missed. Not there." So I think the carbohydrate is the bad guy to pin it on. Like, you know, we pin it on for other things too.
So was there a reference? Was there a paper published to support that?
No. Well, I never got it anyway.
No,
The 200 grams is something that I hear all the time as well. Like,
Yeah.
Probably it comes from the same place as that when we first got into low carb, we'd say you need 130 grams minimum every day to keep the brain ticking over. And, you know, as a dietitian, I used to kind of preach that in my ignorant days. And of course, when we found out that it's not exogenous carbohydrate that we need, then we kind of had to develop a better understanding. And it might be a similar thing. There might be a 200 gram carbohydrate requirement, but it might come from, you know, endogenous useful carbohydrate availability. I don't know.
And also, I think, you know, with regards to what you were saying, Caryn, with how people approach a low carb dietary approach, is that when you tell a female athlete to drop carbohydrate, they'll do it in a heartbeat. But if you tell them to up the fat or up the protein, they're not very good in that regard, you know? Like women have been cutting food out of their diets forever. And it's actually super simple to do. And some women struggle to up fat and up protein in their diet. So instead, it isn't about low carbohydrate. It's about what we have talked about in the past. It's about it's a low calorie diet, essentially, that puts them in the state that they're in my opinion, you know. So I think that's where people get confused, and so they pin it on carbs, and in fact it's actually low energy availability, low calories.
I totally agree with it. And you can look at the studies that they've done on low carb diets, on certain population groups like PCOS, overweight PCOS individuals, and in other similar situations where the very effect of a low carbohydrate diet has produced phenomenal outcomes in terms of hormone expression, in terms of fertility, in terms of PCOS, all sorts of things. So there's good research. Yes, there always needs to be better research, but there is reasonably good research to show that low carb can be incredibly beneficial. So, you know, why are we pinning carb as the bad guy? Yeah.
I think one of the things that actually the only study that I see referenced a lot for this is the study by I don't know if I'm going to pronounce their names right, Lux and Thurma, from I think it was back in 2013. And one of the reasons I think that's so highly touted as being support for this is because it's quite a hard study to read. Right? I'm saying that as someone who probably reads a lot of studies around the low carb area, and it's a little bit convoluted in the reading. So it appears that you have a group who were eating very low carbohydrate, but in fact they weren't. They were eating a diet that was based on Ensure drinks predominantly. It was around 57% of calories from carbohydrate. So it was relatively high. I think from memory, I may even have a note here, but from memory, it was around 150 odd grams of carbohydrate in the lowest carbohydrate group. Now, the key is that they weren't carb restricted groups per se. They were drastically energy restricted groups. So we're looking at that lowest carb group being a function of having a diet that was greater than 700 calories per day below their requirement. And that was the group in which they saw a fairly big effect on luteinizing hormone pulsatility. But you didn't see that at the higher ends. And so, you know, we would have to say, well, maybe that shows that there's an effect of a relative carbohydrate deficiency, if you will, because their calories were so low, they were supplied with lesser amounts of carbohydrate. But it seems far more consistent with the research to say that it's likely that it's just a drastic energy restriction has, you know, those sorts of problems, because we know they're going to occur with reds. We know that's going to occur in men as well for drops in testosterone function and things. So it seems like it's a bit of a misreading of really just one study. Then, as you said, Caryn, you then look at the reviews that have been done on low carbohydrate diets in relation to hormone balance in women specifically, and you see that across that range of research, we typically actually see improvements in menses and improvements in ovulation. We see improvements in fertility. So all of those things tend to improve, especially because a lot of those studies are performed on people with, various problems of insulin resistance like PCOS. So it's certainly not consistent with the research to pull out a study that wasn't even looking at low carb to support the idea that low carb affects luteinizing hormone pulsatility. Have you guys looked into that research at all? Either the Luxemthuma study or maybe the Palumbo review on low carb and female hormone balance?
I've only looked at your summary because you did such a great job at summarising it. But I mean, look, Ensure is such a rubbish product. I'm sorry. It's not nutrition. It's got seed oils and just horrible things in it. So I think if you're going to, if you want to come out and do female hormone research, which is so under researched, gosh, let's just try to do it properly. Give them some decent food. I can see a really good follow-on study from that one. Low calorie, you have two groups. You have very low calorie. Within the low calorie, you have a high carb versus low carb group, and then you can have the higher calorie, same thing, and you can tease that out. But I think it's kind of, I know everyone pushes their own research, but I think it's irresponsible to do a study that's not actually low carb, and that's based on a product that has horrible ingredients, and push some outcomes that will scare the world into thinking that low carb's not for females.
Well, I don't think it was the authors who concluded that either, just in their sort of defense. I think it's other people who have misinterpreted the study, because from my reading of it, they were really focused on that energy availability as being the key factor. But again, it's, I'm sure you guys have glanced at it. It's, at first reading, it seems like it's looking at low carb, but then you look at it a little bit further and think, no, that's not the case. And I think we see that with so many studies. What appears to be initially, when we actually start to read through them properly and read those methods, it's kind of like, okay, there's actually something a little bit different to what I initially thought here.
Well, I guess, any study where there is a negative calorie balance, you almost have to just discard it, because, and this isn't just with females, like males are just as much danger as being a negative energy balance as females. And there's some great studies that came out a couple of years ago from a Danish group that showed that males who are 400 calories in deficit a day, they have significant reductions in testosterone. It has implications on bone density and the whole rest of it. So, like we said from the start, it's not a male-female thing. It's an overall thing that, there are some problems with hormones, but from my experience, working with females and males, it's more the energy deficit. And I have a lot of athletes saying, I can't do fasted training. It's not very good for me. And that is one of the main problems with fasted training, is that, especially when you're talking about ultra endurance athletes, they'll go out in the morning and they'll go and ride, they'll start at 7 and they'll ride for 4 hours. And by the time they get home, it's, midday. And it's actually very, very hard to get those calories back on board. And that's the main problem that I see with fasted training, is that it's hard to get that back. And if you think you do that day in, day out, and then that's a recipe for disaster for sure. But it's nothing to do with the macronutrient content. It's everything to do with the negative energy balance that's being put out.
I agree 100%. And I think that's where there is actually a functional rationale for there being a potential for hormonal imbalance, both from fasting, and not just fasted training, but just fasting in general, and from a low carb diet. Now, it's not because of the fasting and it's not because of the low carb diet. It's that I think with people who tend to perpetually undereat, and I'm one of those people who will fall into a pattern of undereating, if I'm fasting or if I'm especially if I'm strict keto, I need to be very aware of how much I'm eating, because the tendency would be just to not eat.
Yeah.
And I do see that in clients sometimes.
For sure. And now we just published a paper in the Nutrition and Health Journal, and we looked at bioinflammation markers. And the main thing that was shown with a low-carb diet, and this was a 4-week study, carbs were less than 50 grams per day, was serum leptin was elevated, so suppressing appetite. And that's why one of the main reasons a low-carb diet is so good for people losing weight, right, is because it makes you feel more satiated, you don't eat as much. And, as well as many of the benefits it can give you, I think that's one of the, especially if you're someone who doesn't need to lose weight and your energy expenditure is very high, then that's the main problem and the main thing you have to be aware of. And then you double it in a lot of people's cases with fasted training, then that can be a recipe for disaster.
And sometimes it's athletes recognizing it's not a black and white approach. It's not that you either train fasted or you have a heap ton of carbohydrate pre-training and then during your training session, like that's when those train low strategies come in, where you might start fasted and delay feeding. Or you might fuel with fat or protein prior, so they've got calories on board, which will change that stress response, but it's still not the putting in that glucose. And I think there was that study that came out a few weeks ago that showed that whilst fat oxidation was suppressed, they still were able to enhance endurance adaptations at that kind of gene expression level when they took on board protein.
Yeah, those studies have been done, and there's actually a number of studies. I have a PhD student at the moment, Jeff Rothschild, he's studying that very thing. And I know that in his literature review, and you would have read the literature review, Mikki, is that it is quite clear that having protein has the same. If you're looking at fat oxidation specifically, it has the same effect of not eating at all. So there's really no difference. But having carbs definitely suppresses your overall fat oxidation, if that's something that you're actually looking to achieve. So that, I think that's really interesting. And I have an online course that takes people through like a low carbohydrate approach to long distance endurance sports. And one of the main questions we always get is like, oh, I feel really tired when I do my fasted training. I can't do it very well. And to this point, we don't really know if low glycogen training is worse or better than fasted training. So I think at the moment it's pretty much low glycogen or no glycogen training is just as good as fasted training from an adaptive standpoint. So it doesn't mean you have to be fasted, but there is this fear of fasted training, particularly among females. And I'll get into that. And just to go on into that space a little bit more, we've actually just had a survey done. We're just in the midst of writing that up. We had 2,000 people, and it was all about fasted training, and it's why do you do fasted training? And it was literally 50% say they do fasted training because they thought it would give them performance benefit, and then 50% said they don't do it because they think it's not going to help their training. So like people really just don't know what the answer is with that kind of thing. And but also it was much more likely that males were going to do fasted training and females were not going to do fasted training because of this kind of myth idea that they can't do it, which I thought was a real interesting thing. So the dogma's infiltration's very high.
I would also.
And what do you think the real impact of that is? Because from my point of view, I don't actually think on balance it's that big a deal. If someone wants to train fasted or not, unless you're doing it for a specific purpose, but for, let's say, the bulk of your training, especially if you're not at the pointy end of performance, I would say that I would always fall back on the default, which is that if someone is eating a good nutrient replete diet and they're getting in enough of what they require over the day or over days, then whether they train fasted or they fast in general, whether they carb backload or, practice early time restricted feeding, whatever it happens to be, I think those all pale in significance to just getting in what you require overall.
Again, the content before context before content, as they always say, and it's always dependent on what you're actually really trying to achieve. So if someone is specifically doing some kind of ultra endurance event and they're specifically trying to have an impact on their fat oxidation, then I would say that being fasted or low glycogen or something like that and not having carbohydrates available is beneficial. But if that isn't your goal, then I totally agree with you. It's not the most important thing because it's not within the context of what you're trying to achieve. And, and then the most important thing is having a balanced diet and having, energy availability and all the rest of it. So.
And for most people, I think as well, a dietary strategy that allows them to auto-regulate better. And so for a lot of people, I think that's why fasting works, of course, because it limits the feeding window. They tend to not overeat. Similarly, that's why, low carb or keto can work well for people because, as you suggested, it's so satiating, they tend to not overeat. So to speak to one of the questions that's come through, would you suggest having regular intervals of food, like every 2 hours versus maybe 1 or 2 big meals? I think it really depends what's going to allow the person to auto-regulate most effectively. And I'd fall on the default of the fewer meals you require to be nutrient replete is probably going to be easier for you to do because there's less choice conundrum and you can actually exercise that human pattern of eating until you're full and then again when you're hungry, which I think is valuable.
I think it works much better as well when people focus on protein. And I think that with all the, and this is what, and I think we're probably all in agreement here, I'm just assuming we are, but we all talk about protein. Yeah, and it's...
I'm not going to flex my muscles right now.
I just noticed there wasn't much there, actually.
And particularly if they're, instead of focusing so much on macros, because we don't think about we don't think about food in terms of macros, or it adds that added complication that people actually don't really need to think about if they've got their diet quality sorted, I think, and so if they start the meal with the base of the protein and they toggle the fat and carbs accordingly. So, and I mean, everyone is different as to how they do it, but when I talk to my clients, I'm like, right, if you kind of set yourself up with a decent amount of protein, and then, if the meal is higher in fat, maybe you want to drop those carbs down a bit. Or if, you've got a little bit of additional carbs in there, then, hey, maybe you do want to drop that fat down. And it all kind of washes out in the end. And it's not, just because you have like a higher fat kind of meal on one day doesn't mean that you have to be overly concerned with the fat intake and that. Like it's that whole auto-regulation thing, right? Like you generally speaking across the course of 3 or 4 days, if you've sorted it out, everything will on balance kind of work in your favor if you get that, if you are able to auto-regulate. And I think that people to say that you just eat intuitively without any kind of dietary approach initially that focuses on protein, I think that's when people can, this is a whole other topic, but that's when people can really get into trouble because it's really difficult to eat intuitively if you're coming from a high carb approach or you don't really think about protein so much, in my experience.
I reckon we all agree with you, Mikki. But it's one of those things that's another villain that's kind of come out recently as the protein villain now. Like it's just not only is fat a villain, now protein is a villain. So we should only really eat carbohydrates by the sounds of things anyway. So, but and I guess that comes a lot from the kind of the plant-based movement. Less protein, mTOR, and all that. And I mean, I think the low carb diets, lots of them are suggested to be low in protein as well, but that's particularly with athletes, as you know, it's one of the main mistakes that I think is often made is that protein restriction is just a sure way to really make things very difficult for yourself. I mean, my recommendation is always to not really even think about the amount of protein you're having because it's majorly satiating anyway, and then it just sorts you out and it goes you into that auto-regulation anyway. So.
Can I just add in a point there about fasted training in females? It could also potentially be the case that some females feel psychologically satisfied by having something prior to exercise. So that could be another drive to want to eat. Like if they don't have a specific goal, as you were saying, Dan, of I need to get optimal fat adaptations, therefore I'm going to train fasted. They might feel that, I shouldn't be training fasted because, of these reasons. And also I feel like I'm going to potentially run out of energy. Therefore, I should just have something beforehand. That could be, I've seen that in some people. And just another comment on the whole hormone thing. We've been talking about reproductive hormones, but the exact same argument, from a practice and a literature perspective, applies to thyroid hormones as well. There's a group of people who say, and again, particularly females, you need, low carb diets are really bad for the thyroid hormone. And in actual fact, when you look at the literature, low carb diets have been beneficial for thyroid and for thyroid function and for thyroid related conditions. But some people who tend to overdo it, and that is likely the enormous calorie deficit that they shouldn't be doing, that might have the impact on the thyroid, not the carbohydrate, the overall calorie. And then you get that whole, we need carbohydrate to convert thyroid hormones. Okay, then, well, how much carbohydrate do we need? Is there any literature on that? No. So it's the same argument, and it's another fear mongering for females. It's low carb fasting, and reproductive hormones and thyroid hormones. And together it's like the perfect storm of no.
And we would suspect that it's unlikely that would be a problem, right? Because we know, and this speaks to Dan's point about protein, that gluconeogenesis is demand-driven, not supply-driven. And so if we have demand for a certain amount of glucose, and we've got to remember that beta-hydroxybutyrate can supplant glucose in many processes in the body, but that notwithstanding, if we have a requirement for glucose, we have a very good capacity to create it. And so for most of our subliminal processes, we would have to assume that is going to be ample. Now, with the thyroid thing, I think it's really interesting because we probably, I don't know, but this is what Stephen Phinney and others have suggested, is that it's likely that when we have a higher carbohydrate intake, we simply require more thyroid hormone. That seems to be evidenced by their research, which showed that there was a slight drop in T3, but there were no clinical symptoms or signs of, hypothyroidism. So we don't see any functional outcome. And in fact, as you suggest, a lot of people actually get a lot of benefits from a low carb or keto diet for thyroiditis. Now, that could also be due to a whole bunch of other things, because it's going to be an exclusionary diet that could potentially help with some of those factors of autoimmune thyroiditis and stuff like that. So, yeah, it's pretty complex, but I think because it's complex, we need to understand that the body regulates itself very effectively when it has repletion of calories and repletion of micronutrients. Where those things aren't present, then we start to run into trouble.
I was just going to say, it's quite, we sit here and have this conversation and we keep circling back to the same thing. And it's quite amazing that the real take home is that ultimately it's eating the right food and to the appropriate amount that is the most important, because, the thyroid issue is likely again to do with energy availability. And, if you do have those down regulations of certain things and you don't have the capacity to do something about it because you're in a negative energy balance, and that's where it comes to. And the thyroid thing was very much popularized by, Ben Greenfield. He was one of the people who did low carb ketogenic diet, and his thyroid was just reportedly was just shot. And everyone, everyone always uses that as a quote. But again, you can't. He was also training for Ironman at the same time and ketogenic, which I don't think it's a really good thing to be, to do. I think, what I always suggest is kind of a moderate, more like 130, 150 grams per day, not less than 50, which is, not being shown to be that great for someone who's doing that amount of exercise. So it's like, always the devil is in the detail, as they say.
Yeah, and I think as well, like we talk about fasted training and we talk about low carb diets. Like if you want to do fasted training, and it's that all or nothing approach again, right? And I was just thinking when you were talking, Cliff, that there's real utility in like training fasted. Maybe half the time that you train fasted, and then maybe half the time you go out fed. And similarly, on a few days of the week, maybe on your recovery days where you have less energy expenditure, then you do eat a little less, and you just happen to eat less carbohydrate. And I think it's Morton and James Morton, maybe it was him that coined the fuel for the work required kind of no.
Oh, it's probably me. I probably said that.
The great Cliff.
It was either great Cliff, or it was James Morton. And I think that's, I think that is key, because the body responds to that. It likes that high energy output and high energy intake to support it. Equally though, if you're not doing much, then there's less requirement for calories. So it's recognizing that.
Well, you can try and do a longevity fasting protocol like me and exercise at the same time and see how that works out for you. Not very well. Low energy input, high energy output.
And
probably works well for a little while.
2 kids in there as well, Dan.
Yeah, that was pretty hard. But just on your point, you say that kind of, it's all about what the body needs. In that same survey that I talked about before, the people who did the least fasted training was elite people. And and the main reason I believe that is the case is because they're basically training so much, and it's just the case that they have to keep on getting food, and you just don't want to be going out in the morning when you're probably waking up much more hungry because of the amount of the fuel you've used the day before. And it goes to show you fuel for the work required, and those guys can need to eat more, whereas people who are just training 8 hours a week can get away with more fasted training and being a bit more periodized when and how often they eat.
I think with what both Mikki and you have said, Dan, it also points to that, what I think we all know to be a truism now, that one person's keto is not another person's keto. One person's low carb is not another person's low carb. And it gets to the point where I actually think the sort of arbitrary delineation between low carb and keto is kind of meaningless, because we can have someone who needs to be on an extremely low carb diet to achieve this idea of nutritional ketosis. We can have someone who basically just removes obligate carbs or even has some carbohydrate and they're still in ketosis. So what's the differentiator there? Really, it comes down to their metabolic tolerance to carbohydrate, insulin sensitivity, those types of things, and how much fuel they're expending, particularly from that more glycolytic activity. So it's not, I don't think we can anymore draw those arbitrary thresholds of carbohydrate intake. You must be under 20 grams, or you must be under 30 grams or 50 grams or 100 grams, because it doesn't actually make a lot of sense in the context of an individual.
Agree.
Well, I mean, we always talk, like, one of the things that I always talk about is we say find your sweet spot, and that's what it's about. It's about, I do believe that everybody should go through a ketogenic period where they're trying to go, make that adaptation happen, or quite a harsh period. But then it's about, you're not like that forever. You can come out of it, and then it's all about finding your own individual sweet spot. And that idea of what is ketosis, it's such an interesting question. And Caryn and I were part of a systematic review, and we were talking, one of the reviewers was like, how do you know you're in keto? This paper can't be included because they weren't in ketosis. And the point was that it was a 12-week study, and 50 grams, the subjects were at 50 grams of carbohydrates every day. So that didn't change. And they started off with BHB, so beta hydroxybutyrate, above 0.5. But as the study went on, carbohydrates stayed exactly the same day all the time. But ketone levels went down eventually, and they end up at like 0.2. So I say, well, this isn't a ketogenic study. Well, you're telling me that it was only ketogenic for the first 2 weeks and not for the rest, even though the diet's not changed? And that's it's such this magic number of 0.5, and what is ketosis is such a random thing that no one really understands.
Yeah, it is random, but it is interesting because I think we've all evolved in our thinking around it as well. Because like 7 years ago, it was absolutely 0.5 millimoles or above, you were in ketosis. And then just as we learned more and we read more and we just saw more, we realized, you come to that realization, and maybe it's just that everyone that kind of needs to come to that as well. I didn't.
Cliff knew that 20 years ago, though.
No,
Just so you know.
yeah.
No,
Yeah,
that was
I
one of
learned
the,
it 10 years ago.
that was one of those interesting things where having had sort of some relatively long history of working with ketogenic diets, I accepted it as the lingua franca, right? And I just assumed that someone must have done some research on it. And that's why I asked Steve Finney about it. What's that?
What I assume.
Yeah, it was funny when I asked Dr. Stephen Finney about it, and he kind of went, well, that's what we kind of thought.
It's the same. It comes, the two random stats of nutrition is 0.5 ketosis and 200 grams of carbohydrates for females.
Yeah, exactly.
It was interesting because several years ago I examined a PhD thesis, and this person used the threshold of nutritional ketosis as 0.1. And I was like, what? Like, everyone knows it's 0.5. Where's the 0.1 from? And they referenced an animal study, a rat study. And then during the Viva, we had a conversation about this. And he said, I looked at every single piece of literature out there, and I traced it back to an animal study, and that was the best piece of literature that could support it. So, of course, all of his results were like magnanimous because they were all over 0.1. Well, he couldn't fault it, right? Because the actual threshold was, thanks to Steve Finney, you kind of made it up. And now I don't even less.
But there is research that differentiates between different magnitudes of carbohydrate restriction now, thankfully, because we did it, Caryn, and looks at the magnitude of beta hydroxybutyrate increase and things like that. And I think we would now know fairly conclusively that you can eat as much carbohydrate as you want, and you're probably going to be around 0.1, 0.2, irrespective of everything else. Yeah. I wanted to actually bring it back as well and make a comment on something you said earlier, Caryn, because I think it's really important. The sort of psychological, psychosocial, psycho-emotional aspects of why we eat. Because one thing that I see a lot, particularly with either fasting or fasted training, is that some people are trying to go against what their neuropsychophysiology is telling them. What I mean by that is you might have people who, feel a lot better eating before training for whatever reason. And if they're still getting results, I would say, well, that's great. Keep doing it. On the other hand, I also see people who have been told to eat, for example, 50 to 100 grams of carbohydrate before training so that they can beat the cortisol dragon. And they don't want to eat before training. They hate it. They feel sick while they're training. They would much rather be fasted, but they've been told this law. And so I think how we feel around food is critically important, because if those things don't matter that much in the context of a day or days, by trying to override them with willpower in comparison to the things that actually matter, we're probably not going to last. And we really need to be aware of that for adherence sake as practitioners, because that's our most difficult challenge, I think.
I agree. I mean, I do think, and you guys work with the level of eliteness that you work with is probably different to the level that I tend to work predominantly with. And I think the elite athlete is more open to tell me what to do and I'll do it and I'll suck it up. Whereas the more of the recreational athlete is a little bit more married to food and the psychology around food. And I'm not quite sure how we deal with that in an elite sense, because you're going for more of a proof of concept where the athletes will do anything. So I think in my world, the athletes that I work with, it's a little bit easier because I can get them to rely or try and tap into their intuition a little bit more. But maybe the elite don't necessarily have that. I'm not sure. Maybe you guys can jump in there.
I think there's a finer line, and I think with the average sort of, I don't like to say average, but with our Gen Pop people that I work with who just want to thrive in life, I think they really can auto-regulate. I think sometimes athletes can't auto-regulate as well because the demands of their training are, super normal. And so they need to be that much finer with what they're doing. And then it comes down to, a bit of a finer balance of finding what works for the individual. But also, I really think it's important to look outside dietary dogma and look at outcomes-based nutrition. I talk about this a lot with Eric Helms. I think it's pretty easy reading from the research to see where low carb is best suited and maybe where it's not. And so, for example, if I have a client who wants to put on as much muscle as they possibly can, I'll probably just say, eat some carbs, dude. And it's probably going to be a dude because a lot of women don't want to do that. But if it is, it's going to be the same thing. I'm still going to call you a dude. Eat some carbs, dude. And you'll often see that the dogma against that is you'll be sitting on a low carb forum and someone will be saying, I can't put on any muscle. What should I do? And everyone's saying fat bombs, do this, do that. And I often jump on and say, eat some carbs. And then everyone's like, how dare you? Why on earth would you eat carbohydrate? But there's going to be individual variability there. And a lot of it's determined by obviously where the person is now, but we forget that it's also determined by where they want to be.
And and to that point, working, having had a little bit more experience now working at the America's Cup with people who want to put on muscle, people who want to put on muscle cannot eat to their auto-regulation. That's a prime example that you need to stuff your face beyond belief to get that right. And you're not going to do that with fat and protein because you'll want to be very sick. And also, obviously, the insulin is a massive thing that actually is beneficial for muscle growth as well. So,
and there's genetic variation there too, right? There will be some guys who just will not be able to gain muscle. For sure. Yeah.
It's kind of interesting, that whole weight gain, weight loss thing. And I know the low carb community are totally anti. It's all about calorie intake and energy intake. But man, you can't really argue against it. And if you look at something totally different, which is the National Weight Control Registry in the US. So this is a national database of people who have lost 10% of their body weight and have kept it off for more than a year. They can then go into the database and put in all their demographics and they do research on them. Well, the reality is that for all the people that qualify, which is a loss of a certain amount of body weight and put it off for 1 year, they do it very differently. So about 45% of them do low carb, about 55% of them do high carb, and within that, some of them do shakes, and some of them do food, and some of them do fasting, and some of them jump up and down. And you can't actually. I mean, you can say one is better than the other when you've got something like type 2 diabetes and conditions of insulin resistance. You can say you can lose weight anyway, but I would recommend that you do it with low carb because the benefits to insulin resistance and other things are going to be superior. But it's kind of a similar thing for weight gain. If the protein is adequate to allow muscle gain or extra muscle gain, then just put the calories in from wherever it makes sense for you. If it's extra protein, extra carb, extra fat, or a combination of three, it's what you can do and keep doing.
I agree. I think, if we look at it just, in an objective sense, we would probably say that on balance, people gain muscle more effectively with more carbohydrate in the diet. They lose fat more effectively with less carbohydrate in the diet, but the effect size between them is actually pretty small if we correct for protein and calories. So overall, what's going to be best? And I know I'm sounding here like every other moderate nutritionist on the planet. I never thought I'd be a moderate nutritionist, but it comes down to what people can stick to, right? If they can stick to it and it's going to give them results, the effect size over time can actually be pretty minimal.
Yeah, and that's what the studies don't look at. And obviously for good reason, you can't do a lifelong study to see what people do and keep sticking to. But the studies are typically proof of concept studies. So, I mean, even most people, all the studies that we've been involved with, most people can't stick to doing something for 12 weeks, let alone, their whole life. So it does make you think about the research and the practice quite differently.
Yeah, definitely. So I wanted to finish off with one small thing which is tangential to hormone balance, mainly because Dan brought it up. I think the reason I want to end on this, Dan, is because it shows the complexity of the topic we're grappling with, right? Because diet's complex, how it interacts with the human body is complex, and how we actually dig data out of studies can be pretty complex as well. Now, you were sent through a fairly recent study on the purported negative effects of a ketogenic diet on bone health.
Yeah. I thought that was a super interesting one because it's, go on. Yep.
Did you want to preface anything about that, or should I just?
I was sending it through to you because I was interested in it, and looking at that study, calories, energy expenditure is the same between the groups, which is interesting. But yeah, there were. I don't really understand that the markers that they measured in terms of bone health, but it did show that lower carbohydrate availability did seem to affect the overall bone health. And I have had some athletes who I've worked with who've gone on a low carb diet. They have got stress fractures, but whether that is a result of training or is a result of them doing them both at the same time, I have no idea. I myself, before in 2018, got a stress fracture in my sacrum. It just tweaked my interest. It was of interest, and then I wanted to get your opinion of it. And I guess, from my perspective, I think that study, the carbs are very low. If you look to less than 35 grams per day, which is probably, and if you think about how that would have, and over a short term, it would affect your cortisol. Maybe that's having some sort of stress response that's, and then who knows what the overall effect is. But so let's talk about it.
Yeah, I think you make a really good point about that, because again, I would wonder if that's actually a practically applied ketogenic diet for an athlete, because every athlete that I've ever worked with is going to be having more than 30 grams of carbohydrate. So we'd have to wonder if that's actually a true indication of what happens. Yeah. To speak to your point, though, I think it's really important when we see things like this that there needs to be functional outcome research resulting from this. So, what is the prevalence of stress fracture, for example, in people following low carb versus in people following high carb? That would give us probably some good in vivo in situ outcome evidence.
Yeah, but just to interrupt there, that's the point, is that we can, like you said from the very start of this conversation, people pinpoint things, but athletes get stress fractures all the time, and nobody out there is saying you're getting stress fractures because you're on a high carbohydrate diet. No one's saying that. But if a number of times, if a low carb athlete gets stress fractures because they're on a low carb diet, it's a funny world we live in. But to your point, 35 grams is very low for an athlete as well. So maybe it doesn't have that practical significance.
Yeah. Well, I'm not an expert in bone health. So the bone markers as well, to me, are things that I know a little about, but I'm certainly not an expert. But there were a few things that did pop up when I read through the study when it came out a little while back. I think you posted it, Mikki, and I had some interesting thoughts, what I thought were interesting thoughts about it. Number one, that CTX, which was, seemed to be adversely affected, is really a measure of bone turnover, but it's not necessarily a good marker for bone mineral density. So we would suspect that would point to there being a reduction in bone mineral density over time if that continues to occur, but we wouldn't necessarily know. The other interesting thing is the P1P is kind of equivocal, because that may well be associated with an inverse association. Sorry, there may be an inverse association between P1P and bone mineral density. So P1P was reduced in the low carb group. So we couldn't necessarily say that by association that's going to mean there's going to be lower bone mineral density or reduced calcification of bones. The kicker, though, really is the osteocalcin, because that's probably the key marker, right? For bone mineral density, we see a pretty strong association between osteocalcin and bone mineral density in osteoporosis studies. And that was fairly markedly reduced, and it seemed to be the most sort of significant result there. So that would certainly say, from that, we would certainly say that, well, there needs to be further research here, because there are enough indications coming from this. But some interesting things came up for me with that, because we certainly know that osteocalcin is vitamin K dependent. Vitamin K, interestingly, was left out of the nutritional analysis, but the authors did say that the low-carb group, the keto group, were less micronutrient replete than the higher carb group, which would make sense, particularly with respect to vitamin K, because if you're not taking in the same vegetable matter to try and keep a very arbitrarily low carb amount, it may well be that you're not getting in enough vitamin K. Given that vitamin K is a pretty key trigger for osteocalcin release, that's a pretty important factor. And there's also a pretty interesting interplay between insulin and osteocalcin. So we would suspect that with a marked reduction in insulin response in a ketogenic group, there will be some interplay with osteocalcium levels, and whether that, and with glucose as well. And so whether that is sustained, we just wouldn't know. So I think it's a super interesting study, but there's enough questions that we certainly need to look a bit deeper into it. And I would certainly be looking at the further research in osteocalcin as compared to insulin and glucose in low carb populations, whether there were micronutrient issues with that, and then obviously just taking a step back and looking at the functional outcomes of whether we actually see an increase in bone-related problems in people following lower carb diets.
Because the long term view is the absolute key, right?
Absolutely.
That's because all those markers you don't, without the because things can change so rapidly before they counteract. It's just the stress response. Same thing that we always see with everything, whether it be training or any kind of nutrition intervention. The long-term approach is absolutely critical. You know, it's the same why we don't like 3-week ketogenic diet studies, right?
Exactly, and it's, as we all know, it's difficult to actually see sometimes, because we can't just take a random sample of the population and assign them to carbohydrate quartiles or quintiles, because you're simply not going to get enough people who are following a low carb diet. You know, all of the research which shows that low carb increases mortality, they're not eating a low carb diet, and if you go into the data anyway, they're just eating a shit diet. At either end, you know, where mortality's affected, it's because they're either in the Coke and lollies brigade at the high end of carb intake, or they're at the pizzas and burger end of the spectrum, which is leading to have a relatively lower carb intake. So very difficult to do, because we don't actually have enough sample population over the long term to properly evaluate observationally what happens with low carb diets.
I mean, that's why the fastest study by the fastest study by Follick and Vinny is one of such a good study, right? It's such a powerful study, because that's possibly the only one that's really looked at these. It's not really a long-term study, but it is looking at people who have been doing something long-term.
Yeah, well, and with those types of studies, it would be very interesting to, even with that, you would expect there to be temporal changes over 1 to 3 years in bone mineral density from these effects, if they're actually occurring.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
I just want to add a comment in there. I haven't actually read the study, but I think that there's a lot more that we need to know about micronutrients. I think, we live by the RDIs, recommended daily intakes, and the whole system is so flawed. There are no specific RDIs for athletes. Only iron.
Yeah.
And the RDIs are just semi-random values that have been established in a paradigm of high carb, moderate protein, low fat. And I think when you switch that round, your whole metabolism gets reorchestrated, and there's an upregulation of some of the vitamins and maybe and minerals, and a downregulation of others, and we know nothing about that. So I think, it's very unfair to point the finger at low carb for bone health. We need to know a lot more about micronutrients in both situations, general micronutrients for athletes, and high carb situations and low carb situations. I think it's very, very little known, and very few studies have been done. And in fact, some of the studies that have been done have shown a discrepancy between the actual amount that people are eating, the RDI, and the serum values as well. So there's a disconnect there. So there's a double disconnect in the area of micronutrients. So that's a really that's a very interesting area that we need to do some studies on micronutrients, guys.
We do. Well, hopefully.
Yeah.
Hopefully we can do some of those studies in the coming years. I think we've probably got a lot of ideas for things we can look at just from this conversation alone, but there's a lot of others out there that we've discussed. We just need to get on and do it. But thanks all of you for being on today. I know you're very busy people, even amongst these pandemic lockdown conditions. Is there anything you want to leave any of the listeners with? And even if not, let us know where they can find all about you.
One thing we didn't discuss is electrolytes, which we do not have time to go. It would be like an entirely other hour that we could spend talking about it. But oftentimes the problems with low carb may well be, in fact, just low electrolytes. And I just saw the comment from Jinx, I'm sorry if that's not correct, on your situation. And the first thing that I think about is electrolyte availability in your approach with your training. And so, but again, that's a whole other topic to consider, because of course our requirements may increase on a low carb approach, and we may not be able to hold on to electrolytes and stuff the way we can on a higher carb approach.
That's an interesting point that speaks to the larger topic of energy availability, though, because obviously we know that, for example, with the purported keto flu, I think we know that absolutely electrolytes help, because they are one of those key factors that is altered in the first few days of a low carb diet, although we do acclimate very quickly. But again, you know, what we saw in our research was that the biggest factor in keto flu symptoms was actually not the magnitude of carb restriction. It was how much people had restricted energy. So although all those other things are important, like beta hydroxybutyrate, whether you're producing ketones effectively, whether you're having enough water and electrolytes, they're critically important. But bigger than all of that is actually energy availability, probably.
And I also think that the sodium side is only really prevalent in the first. I don't think it's a long-term thing. I think it's just more prevalent in those first months of adaptation. And I don't know whether you actually need more sodium as on a low-carb diet. Generally, overall, I mean, certainly, it's yet to be seen, really. I mean, I think sodium is an overly pumped up thing generally, anyway, in the sports nutrition industry. Yeah.
I agree.
We could have another topic on this.
We could, because
we'll get you all back for the sodium roundtable.
Yeah, sodium want to be a good one. I'm just into it because
Yeah.
I'm just writing like a heat course for Endure IQ. So I've done a lot of research in sodium recently, so I'm pretty versed in the area.
And you've actually done primary research in sodium as well, right?
No,
Electrolytes
not primary myself. No.
Okay. I thought you'd done everything.
Sorry to disappoint.
People ask me a topic and I say, "Oh, Dan's probably researched that."
It's funny, I do the same to you.
Yeah, I haven't. Maybe keto. That's about it. So where can people find you, Dan? You mentioned Endure IQ.
Yeah, I mean, Endure IQ is the company where we do online courses primarily for long-distance triathletes, and we have courses on low-carb performance training. Currently building one in the heat, and Mikki is an instructor on our low-carb one, and we have a specific female, which is topical for today, specific female module. But yeah, guests on Instagram, the Plews, Twitter, normal things. So
cool, and we'll put all those links in the show notes as well. Mikki, where can everyone find you?
Primarily Facebook under Mikki Williden PhD, or Instagram Mikki Williden, same at Twitter actually, and my website mikkiwilliden.com.
Awesome.
Yeah.
And Dr. Caryn Zinn, where can our wonderful listeners find information about you and what you do?
Well, everyone will know not to look on Instagram, because everyone heard that I'm not on Instagram, but you might search a bit closely if you want to see my dog. But aside from that, I'm on old school Facebook, Caryn Zinn Dietitian. and on Twitter, Caryn Zinn, I think, and again, website carynzinn.com. So it's easy to be found these days. So
It is.
Yeah.
Well, thank you guys. It's been an interesting discussion. I'm sure we'll all get together and do this again, but I appreciate your time today.
Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Cliff.
Thank you. Ciao, ciao.
Thanks, guys.
Bye.